It was 11:47 p.m. when the red and blue lights flashed behind her car on Highway 285. Lieutenant Colonel Keisha Williams pulled over, knowing this traffic stop was about to change everything. The officer approaching had no idea who he was dealing with or what was about to unfold in the courtroom that would leave his entire department scrambling. Sergeant Marcus Thompson stepped out confidently. 12 years on the Richmond police force, and he thought he'd seen everything. The black SUV was expensive, which only made him more eager to assert his authority. He'd followed it for 3 blocks before seeing it briefly cross the yellow line. He approached with his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Most people tensed up when they saw those lights, but this woman sat perfectly straight, hands visible on the wheel, with a calmness that seemed rehearsed. Her dark skin caught his flashlight's reflection, and she appeared to be in her 30s, wearing what looked like a uniform jacket. Marcus tapped on the window. It rolled down smoothly, releasing the faint scent of coffee and leather. The woman turned to look at him with steady eyes, not challenging, but not submissive either. It was the look of someone used to being listened to. "Good evening, ma'am," Marcus said with practiced authority. "I'm Sergeant Thompson with Richmond PD. Do you know why I stopped you?" Keisha Williams looked up calmly. 23 years of military service had taught her that real power didn't need to announce itself. "Good evening, officer," she replied clearly. "I assume you'll tell me why." Her response irritated Marcus. Most people immediately started apologizing. This woman's calm confidence seemed like defiance. He noted official documents on the passenger seat. "License and registration," Marcus said. "You crossed the yellow line. Moving violation." Keisha reached for her documents, movements deliberate. As she handed them over, Marcus caught a glimpse of an official military ID in her wallet, but he was focused on establishing control. "Miss Williams," Marcus said, using the diminutive form deliberately. "Crossing the yellow line puts other drivers at risk." "I understand road safety, Sergeant," Keisha replied steadily. "If I crossed the line, it wasn't intentional." "Intent doesn't matter," Marcus replied, writing. "The law is the law." What Marcus didn't know was that Keisha had just returned from a NATO deployment, leading convoy operations through treacherous mountain passes. The idea that she'd recklessly crossed a yellow line was almost laughable. "Step out of the vehicle," Marcus announced, his tone becoming more authoritative. Keisha felt the familiar tension of recognizing escalation. "Is there a specific reason you need me to exit the vehicle, Sergeant?" "When a police officer gives you a lawful order, you comply. Step out." But Keisha Williams had spent 2 decades giving and receiving final orders. She knew the difference between reasonable requests and abuse of authority. She slowly stepped out, revealing her height and military bearing. "Hands where I can see them, Marcus." Keisha stood documenting everything. Time, location, badge number. This was moving beyond a simple traffic citation. "I've complied, Sergeant Thompson," she said, reading his name tag. "What happens next?" Marcus finished writing, but was bothered by her continued composure. Most people were nervous, eager to leave. She stood waiting like she knew something he didn't. "I'm going to search your vehicle," Marcus announced. Keisha recognized the line being crossed. A citation was one thing, but a vehicle search required probable cause. "On what grounds, Sergeant?" she asked respectfully but firmly. "I don't need to explain probable cause," Marcus replied, jaw tightening. "I have authority to search if necessary for officer safety." "Sergeant, I respectfully decline to consent to a search," Keisha said clearly. "This stop has exceeded the scope of the original violation." Rehook mid-story. And that's when Sergeant Thompson made the decision that would change everything. He had no idea that the woman standing calmly beside her SUV had commanded more soldiers than he'd given citations to in his entire career. What happened next would end up in courtrooms, internal affairs investigations, and eventually national news. But in that moment, Marcus Thompson was about to learn a lesson about real authority. Marcus's face darkened at what he perceived as defiance. In his 12 years on the force, he'd developed a reputation for being thorough, for not letting people walk away from traffic stops thinking they'd gotten over on him. This woman's calm refusal to consent to a search felt like a direct challenge to his authority. "Ma'am, you're being uncooperative with a police investigation," Marcus said, his hand moving to rest on his radio. "I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Keisha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. She'd been in enough tense situations to recognize when someone was about to make a serious mistake, but she also knew that the middle of a dark highway at midnight wasn't the place to have a conversation about the limits of police authority. Slowly, Keisha placed her hands on the roof of her SUV, her mind already shifting into a different mode. This wasn't a traffic stop anymore. This was the kind of situation that ended up being reviewed by multiple agencies and written about in training manuals. She began mentally documenting everything: the time, the sergeant's exact words, the escalation from citation to search to what appeared to be an arrest. Marcus pulled out his handcuffs, the metal cold against his fingers. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and failure to comply with a lawful order." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Keisha Williams made a decision. She wouldn't resist, wouldn't argue, wouldn't give Sergeant Thompson any additional ammunition for his but she also wouldn't forget a single detail of this encounter, because she had a feeling that very soon Sergeant Thompson was going to wish this night had gone very differently. The booking process at Richmond City Jail took 3 hours. Keisha was photographed, fingerprinted and processed like any other arrestee, her personal effects confiscated and stored. She used her one phone call to contact her attorney, Michael Harrison, a former military lawyer who now practiced civilian law in Richmond. She gave him the basic facts: traffic stop, refusal to consent to search, arrest for obstruction, and asked him to arrange bail. By 6 a.m., Keisha was released on her own recognizance with a court date set for the following month. Sergeant Thompson's report was already filed, describing an uncooperative suspect who refused to comply with lawful orders during a routine traffic stop. It was a narrative he'd written dozens of times before, and he expected this case to follow the same pattern as all the others: plea bargain, fine, case closed. But what Sergeant Thompson didn't know was that Keisha Williams had spent the night in jail thinking about something her commanding officer had told her years ago. "Lieutenant, real leadership isn't about having fattery over others, it's about taking responsibility when authority is abused." She'd been on the receiving end of an abuse of power, and now she had a responsibility to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. The first sign that this case wouldn't follow the usual pattern came when Michael Harrison filed a motion to dismiss all charges based on unlawful arrest and violation of Fourth Amendment rights. The motion was detailed, professional, and cited case law that made it clear the defense attorney had done his homework. Most public defenders handling traffic cases filed boilerplate motions and hoped for a plea bargain. This was different. The second sign came when the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Chen, actually read the case file instead of just glancing at the charges. Something about the arrest report bothered her, not what it said, but what it didn't say. There was no mention of any suspicious behavior, no indication of probable cause for the vehicle search, no explanation for why a simple traffic violation had escalated to an arrest. The third sign came when Jennifer Chen tried to contact Keisha Williams to discuss a plea agreement. Most defendants charged with obstruction were eager to avoid trial, especially if they had jobs or reputations to protect. But when Jennifer's office called the number listed in the arrest report, they discovered something interesting. "I'm sorry," the voice on the other end said, "but Lieutenant Colonel Williams is currently in meetings. Can I have her return your call?" Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Chen had prosecuted enough cases to know that people didn't just throw around military titles casually. Either this defendant was lying about her rank, or there was a lot more to this case than appeared in Sergeant Thompson's report. When Keisha returned the prosecutor's call that afternoon, Jennifer's first question was direct. "Ms. Williams, what exactly is your occupation?" "I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army," Keisha replied calmly. "I serve as deputy commander of the 43rd Military Police Battalion at Fort Lee." Jennifer Chen felt her stomach drop. Fort Lee was less than 30 minutes from Richmond, and the 43rd Military Police Battalion was responsible for training military police officers from all branches of the armed forces. If Sergeant Thompson had arrested a high-ranking military police officer without proper cause, this case was about to become a nightmare for everyone involved. "Lieutenant Colonel Williams," Jennifer said carefully, "can you tell me about your experience with law enforcement procedure?" Keisha's response was measured and professional. "I've been a military police officer for 23 years. I've commanded MP units in Iraq, Afghanistan, and 3 different domestic installations. I'm certified in criminal investigation procedures, evidence handling, and constitutional law as it applies to military and civilian populations." In other words, Jennifer realized Keisha Williams knew more about proper police procedures than most civilian cops ever would. If she'd refused to consent to a vehicle search, it was probably because she knew the search was illegal. And if Sergeant Thompson had arrested her anyway, he just made a mistake that could end his career. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in Richmond General District Court. Judge Patricia Moore had been on the bench for 15 years, and she'd learned that thick case files usually meant someone had made a significant mistake. When she saw the extensive motions filed by the defense and the unusual nature of the charges, she knew this hearing would be anything but routine. Sergeant Thompson arrived at the courthouse confident that this hearing would follow the same pattern as hundreds of others he'd testified in. He'd explain his actions, present his report, and the defendant would probably accept a plea bargain. Traffic cases were routine, and he'd never had a problem convincing judges that his arrests were justified. When Keisha Williams walked into the courtroom with her attorney, Thompson got his first good look at her in proper lighting. She wore a conservative business suit, carried herself with military bearing, and looked nothing like the uncooperative suspect he'd described in his report. But what really caught his attention was the small pin on her jacket lapel, the distinctive insignia of the U.S. Army Military Police Corps. For the first time since the traffic stop, Sergeant Thompson felt a flicker of uncertainty. Michael Harrison, Keisha's attorney, opened his presentation with a simple statement. "Your Honor, this case represents a clear example of police overreach and violation of my client's constitutional rights. Lieutenant Colonel Williams was arrested without probable cause for the simple act of exercising her Fourth Amendment right to refuse an unlawful search." Judge Moore leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant Colonel?" "Yes, Your Honor," Michael replied. "My client is a 23-year veteran of the United States Army and currently serves as Deputy Commander of the 43rd Military Police Battalion at Fort Lee. She has extensive training and experience in law enforcement procedures, which is why she recognized that Sergeant Thompson's actions exceeded the scope of a routine traffic stop." Sergeant Thompson felt the blood drain from his face. Military Police Battalion, Deputy Commander, 23 years of experience. This woman wasn't just some civilian who'd watched too many legal dramas on TV. She was a law enforcement professional who outranked most police chiefs in terms of training and experience. The prosecutor, Jennifer Chen, stood up slowly. "Your Honor, after reviewing this case in detail, the Commonwealth has serious concerns about whether the arrest was justified. We'd like to request a recess to further investigate the circumstances of this incident." But Judge Moore was already looking at the case file, her expression growing more serious as she read. "Mr. Harrison, I'd like to hear your client's account of what happened during this traffic stop." Keisha Williams stood and walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence she'd shown during the arrest. She was sworn in, took her seat, and waited for the first question. Her posture was perfect, her voice clear, and her account of the traffic stop was precise and detailed. "Sergeant Thompson stopped me at approximately 11:47 p.m. on Highway 285, Keisha began. "He stated that I had crossed the yellow line, which I do not recall doing, but I did not dispute his observation. I provided my license and registration as requested. The stop should have ended with a citation." "What happened next?" Michael Harrison asked. "Sergeant Thompson ordered me to exit the vehicle without providing a reason. When I asked for an explanation, he became increasingly aggressive. He then stated his intention to search my vehicle, again without providing probable cause. When I declined to consent to the search, as is my constitutional right, he arrested me for obstruction of justice." Judge Moore interrupted. "Lieutenant Colonel Williams, In your professional opinion as a military police officer, was Sergeant Thompson's conduct appropriate for a routine traffic violation? Keisha's answer was clear and direct. No, Your Honor. The stop exceeded the scope of the original violation without proper justification. In military law enforcement, we're trained that any search must be based on probable cause or specific articulable facts, suggesting criminal activity. Crossing a yellow line does not provide probable cause for a vehicle search. And the arrest was retaliatory, Your Honor. I was arrested for exercising my constitutional rights, not for any criminal behavior. Judge Moore turned to Sergeant Thompson. Sergeant, I'd like to hear your explanation for why you felt it necessary to search the defendant's vehicle and ultimately arrest her. Sergeant Thompson stood up, suddenly feeling like every eye in the courtroom was focused on him. His report had seemed solid when he'd written it, but now, faced with a military police officer who clearly knew the law better than he did, his actions felt harder to justify. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative and evasive during the traffic stop. I felt that her behavior warranted further investigation. Can you be more specific about what behavior you found suspicious? Thompson hesitated. How could he explain that her calm confidence had seemed threatening? That her refusal to be intimidated had made him want to assert his authority? That her very composure had made him suspicious? She refused to consent to a search of her vehicle, Thompson said finally. Judge Moore's eyebrows rose. Sergeant Thompson, are you saying that exercising one's constitutional right to refuse a search is grounds for arrest? No, Your Honor, but her overall demeanor was suspicious. What specifically about her demeanor was suspicious? She was too calm. Your Honor, most people are nervous during traffic stops. Judge Moore looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to Keisha. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, is it fair to say that your military training has taught you how to remain calm under pressure? Yes, Your Honor. Maintaining composure in stressful situations is a basic requirement of military leadership. The courtroom was silent for several seconds before Judge Moore spoke again. Sergeant Thompson, in your 12 years of law enforcement, have you received training on constitutional rights and proper search procedures? Yes, Your Honor. And did that training teach you that citizens have the right to refuse consent to vehicle searches? Yes, Your Honor. Then can you explain why you arrested Lieutenant Colonel Williams for exercising that right? Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He backed himself into a corner, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. His arrest of Keisha Williams had been based on wounded pride and a need to assert dominance, not on any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Rehook final. But this was just the beginning. What Judge Moore said next would not only dismiss all charges against Lieutenant Colonel Williams, it would trigger an internal affairs investigation that would end Sergeant Thompson's career and lead to changes in police training protocols across the entire Richmond Police Department. Sometimes justice doesn't just clear the innocent, it holds the guilty accountable. Judge Moore leaned back in her chair, her decision already made. Sergeant Thompson, your actions during this traffic stop represent a fundamental violation of constitutional rights and proper law enforcement procedures. You escalated a minor traffic violation into an unlawful arrest, based solely on the defendant's refusal to surrender her constitutional right. She turned to address the courtroom. All charges against Lieutenant Colonel Williams are dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering a full transcript of these proceedings to be forwarded to the Richmond Police Department's Internal Affairs Division and the Virginia Attorney General's Office for review. Jennifer Chen, the prosecutor, stood up. Your Honor, the Commonwealth agrees with the court's decision. We will be reviewing our policies for prosecuting cases involving questionable arrests. But Judge Moore wasn't finished. Sergeant Thompson, I want to be very clear about something. Lieutenant Colonel Williams has spent over 2 decades serving our country and training the next generation of military police officers. Her commitment to the law and proper procedures is evident in her conduct during this incident. She remained calm, followed proper protocols, and exercised her rights responsibly. The judge's voice carried a tone of disappointment that was somehow worse than anger. You, on the other hand, allowed your ego to override your training. You arrested a decorated military officer for the crime of knowing her rights and refusing to be intimidated. That's not law enforcement, that's abuse of power. Sergeant Thompson felt his career dissolving around him as Judge Moore continued. I am recommending that the Richmond Police Department conduct a thorough review of Sergeant Thompson's arrest record to determine if this incident represents a pattern of behavior. I am also recommending additional training for all officers on constitutional rights and de-escalation technique. Outside the courthouse, Michael Harrison shook Keisha's hand. That was one of the most clear-cut cases of police overreach I've ever seen, he said. You handled it perfectly. Keisha nodded, but her mind was already moving forward. Michael, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. What are our options for holding the department accountable? Within a week, the story had spread beyond Richmond. Military news outlets picked up the story of a decorated MP officer being arrested for exercising her constitutional rights. Civil rights organizations began asking questions about police training and accountability. The Richmond Police Department found itself facing scrutiny from multiple state and federal agencies. Sergeant Marcus Thompson was suspended pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation. Within a month, investigators had found 3 other cases where Thompson had made questionable arrests during traffic stops, all involving black drivers who had questioned his authority or refused to consent to searches. The pattern was clear, and Thompson's career in law enforcement was over. 6 months later, the Richmond Police Department implemented new training protocols developed in consultation with Lieutenant Colonel Keisha Williams and the 43rd Military Police Battalion. The program focused on constitutional rights, de-escalation techniques, and the difference between authority and leadership. During the first training session, Keisha stood before a room full of Richmond police officers and began with a simple statement. Real authority doesn't need to announce itself through intimidation. Real authority earns respect through competence, professionalism, and a commitment to serving others. She paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from skeptical to genuinely interested. I've commanded soldiers in combat zones where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death. But I've never forgotten that true leadership means being strong enough to admit when you're wrong and humble enough to learn from those you serve. One young officer raised his hand. Ma'am, how do we know when we're crossing the line from proper law enforcement to abuse of power? Keisha's answer was simple but profound. When you start treating citizens as the enemy instead of as the people you swore to protect, you've crossed the line. When you let your ego override your training, you've crossed the line. And when you arrest someone for exercising their constitutional rights, you've not only crossed the line, you've become the very thing you took an oath to protect people from. The training program became a model for police departments across Virginia and eventually attracted attention from law enforcement agencies nationwide. Lieutenant Colonel Keisha Williams never sought fame or recognition for her role in improving police training. She simply did what she'd always done. Served her country and her community with integrity, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. Sergeant Marcus Thompson left law enforcement and eventually found work as a security guard at a shopping mall. The badge that had once made him feel untouchable was gone, but perhaps for the first time in years, he was forced to confront the difference between having authority and deserving respect. Sometimes the most important lessons are learned not in classrooms or training academies, but in moments when someone with real authority refuses to back down in the face of abuse. Lieutenant Colonel Williams didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. She simply let the truth speak for itself, and in doing so, she reminded everyone in that courtroom what real leadership looks like.